good morning, and good afternoon. I'm going to be speaking with Robert Neimeyer today. Robert Neimeyer directs the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition and maintains an active consulting and coaching practice there. He has published over 600 journal articles and book chapters, as well as 35 books, including New Techniques of Grief Therapy, and serves as editor of Death Studies. He is currently working to advance a more adequate theory of grieving as a meaning-making process. And welcome, Bob. I'm so delighted that you have joined us today. Thank you so much for your time. And I am so impressed with your generosity. I have asked you to join our festival. You immediately said yes, despite your very busy schedule. And this is a very important topic for us as well, because as you know, we have dedicated our festival this year to the earthquake. Thousands of people have lost their lives and homes, and more than 10 million people have been affected in two major earthquakes, which were very traumatic for many people. Definitely, meaning of life has been challenged or shattered by these events. I guess it's far beyond my ability to comprehend. And you are going to share with us today working with grief and traumatic loss. And would you take us to the relation between grief and trauma and tell us a little bit more about it?
Thank you, Berna, and thanks to all of you for allowing me to be a temporary part of your community of concern, a community of care that's reaching out to those hundreds of thousands and perhaps, as she implies, even millions of people affected by this utter disaster at a humanitarian level. I have worked alongside people who have experienced traumatic losses of many kinds across the course of maybe 4 decades or so as a practicing therapist, and have had the opportunity to study the impacts of traumatic loss of several sorts, suicide loss, homicide, fatal accident, and natural disaster. But I do not have, and I feel fortunate not to have had, the heavy immersion and loss that comes with these quakes in Turkey. I so much appreciate your standing by all of those who are needing to walk through the rubble and try to rebuild their lives. And I want to be a temporary companion to you in this work. So I'm presenting really from a place of humility in that I do not have the on-the-ground awareness that you must surely have of how lives, as Berna says, have been shattered by loss in the context of this disaster. But what I want to bring you is a frame, a kind of set of understandings that I have found helpful in both assessing the places that people feel broken at the level of their grief following a loss from traumatic circumstances. And I want to at least gesture in the direction of some potentially healing practices. The hour and a half or so that we have will not constitute the kind of deep clinical training that, for example, we've been providing here in Singapore over the last months, where we've had the opportunity to spend multiple days, 2 days here, 2 days again here, 2 days again here, focusing on losses to suicide or trauma in general. In that context, of course, we can go deeply into specific techniques and provide tools, practices, guidelines, clinical videos demonstrating their use, and have a chance to practice those skills ourselves with safer losses of our own. Here, we don't have that luxury of time, but I do want to use the time we have as well as possible. All right, I'm going to go ahead as if I had things organized here, but I want to talk with you about the idea of intervening in meaning. And what I want to do is to suggest that meaning, in the sense that we'll be using it here, is something much broader and much deeper than simply cognition or intellectual knowing or understanding, though it includes that too. I want to talk with you about how we need to work with grief, especially following losses of a horrific or traumatic sort, of a kind that waiting for the jets to pass overhead here at Singapore, of a kind that is reflected in the cover art here. This is a photograph that I took in Colombia a couple of months ago, a country that has known violent loss in many forms. And here we see the suggestion of something that might be understood as an earthquake. We see a human figure falling into an abyss, chasm, the world, even the natural world, collapsing around this person. It's this kind of collapse of a known world that people face, sometimes literally, as in Turkey recently, and sometimes, of course, in other forms that are deeply personal rather than collective. My approach to considering grief is grounded in this idea of meaning. A French philosopher named Maurice Merleau-Ponty once said, "Nous sommes condamnés au sens." We are condemned to meaning, pointing to the way in which, as human beings, we're always seeking order and pattern in our experience. We impose certain beliefs and expectations upon experience in order just to navigate our world in practical ways. We construct stories of our lives, day to day, moment to moment, and especially stories of our hardships when life, in some sense, changes abruptly, sometimes at a seismic level that shakes the foundations of those same lives. And in this, then, we are forced to seek a new meaning as we find ourselves standing in a literally and figuratively changed landscape of living that does not resemble the world we once occupied. As we've done a good deal of research on people's attempt to make meaning of loss, we found the same finding again and again and again in many different contexts. The finding that suggests that sense-making predicts better grief adaptation in many populations and many contexts, including in palliative care, normative settings where people may gradually approach death in the context of life-threatening illness. We find there that people's ability to anticipate pending death and to experience anticipatory grief is essentially inversely related to the extent that they can somehow find a way of understanding what they and their loved ones are going through and its implications for their lives. They do better in anticipating the death of the loved one and also in grieving that loss months following the death. We find in the case of natural death losses of all kinds, and in the context of a long program of recent research in COVID bereavement, that the same thing holds. People who are able to comprehend their experience, find some footing in the world, as we say, a sense of grounding, anchorage in the world, do far better in adapting to grief without succumbing to a prolonged and complicating course of adaptation. In the context of violent death losses, these findings are especially dramatic when we study people who lose loved ones by suicide, homicide, fatal accident, natural disaster. What we discover is that people's capacity to make sense of the loss accounts in some of the studies for 100% of the effect of those losses on their subsequent grieving. That is a very dramatic finding. This is to say that, as I will mention to you going forward, that our ability to find meaning in the loss and in our lives and its aftermath speaks volumes about how we adapt to the losses that we've suffered. And we find that in a variety of populations, including bereaved parents, older spouses, younger people, experiencing a variety of losses, that this same basic finding holds. The capacity to make meaning of our experience. It doesn't eliminate our grieving, but it makes it bearable. It makes it something that we can move through and even learn from. And what I'll try to do is to give you a bit of a sense of how this works in the context of traumatic bereavement. As we do this, I want to invoke a concept of beginner's mind, which is used in the practice of Zen Buddhism to describe how we approach experience without preconceptions. We see the world, we see our client's world as best we can, as if through the eyes of a child, meeting suffering without in some way predicting what that meeting will lead to. We open our eyes to what our client brings. Therapy, in this sense, begins with where our clients are and not with where we are. We cultivate a sense of not knowing, and this means we attempt to allow ourselves to be guided at each moment in our encounter with clients by what they need most basically in this moment and what they are ready for in connection with that need. These are two different things. Sometimes, for example, people may greatly need to be able to tell the story of the horror that they have been through, but they're not ready to do that because it implies a prospect of dramatic re-traumatization, as I will illustrate in a little while. And so we need to always be vigilant for, scanning for, what is the person ready to do in relation to this need that they bring forward verbally and non-verbally in connection with their loss. This means that as therapists, we welcome everything. We turn away nothing. Whatever the client brings is relevant, and we help them find the relevance of it. And in some sense, we develop that leading edge that moves in the direction of hope and restoration. I mentioned starting with where the client is, not with where we are. We don't bring in an established protocol and then apply it to a generic client presentation. We're informed by that protocol, and its principles and guidelines may prove relevant to us, but only when the relevance is suggested by what the client now specifically is requiring. And especially in the context of traumatic loss, we and the clients need to find a place of rest in the middle of things, in the middle of all of the anxiety, all of the grief, all of the horror, the fear, the trauma. We need to find a place where we can come to rest and where we can find refreshment and grounding. And this is something that we can promote in the context of our therapies with our clients very directly. Now, let me present to you then a model of meaning, reconstruction, and loss to give you an idea of what I mean by meaning making, and to do this in the context of psychotherapy, in which, in the words of the British psychiatrist Donald Winnicott, we attempt to establish a holding environment with our clients to provide what John Bowlby would call a secure base relationship in which we can provide a kind of container for difficult stories, experiences, emotions, a place of safety in which we can begin to recruit with our clients the very resources they need in order to meet the loss and do the therapy. This implies that we help them find ways of self-soothing, of engaging in emotion regulation, even in the presence of very activating circumstances. We recruit resources not only within people, but outside them, in the context of their families, social circles, communities of support. We may draw on people's spirituality if they hold a particular faith tradition, that's something that's sacred to them and provides orientation to the nature of human life, the nature of suffering, and how it can be borne. Even as secular therapists, we may find ourselves drawing on these same resources, as well as exploring how those spiritual frames may be challenged and changed by the trauma that they've experienced. If people come with a kind of a secular philosophy that provides important principles for living, we are equally attentive to recruiting that as part of what we will draw on in their movement through therapy and through trauma. And finally, I want to emphasize that the relation to the deceased can be one of the most powerful contributions to the resources that people bring into therapy. That is, grief therapy often requires the dead in order to grieve them well. We need the resources of that relationship in ways that I'll try to say more about in order to help people accommodate the tragic loss of that same life. I recognize in this, of course, that some relationships are marked by ambivalence, conflict, or indeed even abuse. And in those cases, of course, we are not looking to activate the relationship as a resource, but maybe instead as a problem to be solved in the context of grief therapy. I'll say more about that in a moment. But with this frame, what we are doing is attempting to scan for how people experience their movement through grief. Grief itself is not a psychopathology, except in its very extreme and entrenched forms. When for example, the ICD-11, the International Classification of Disease of the World Health Organization, and the American Psychiatric Association, both have in recent years included the diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder to describe the 10% of people who may find themselves over a period of years experiencing an unremitting grief that greatly reduces the quality of their life and interferes with their functioning. However, for 90% of people, they're not struggling with that kind of grief. They may need support, but of a different kind that does not necessarily require long-term therapy, except when they do. And in the context of traumatic loss, we know the incidence of prolonged and complicated grief is not 10%. It is closer to 30%. It varies somewhat depending on the cause of death. But this is to say that, of course, I imagine the office of virtually every therapist in Turkey would be swelling with the number of referrals for some of the direct and indirect consequences of the disasters that we've established. In this process of grieving, then, what we're doing is we are listening with our ears and we are listening with our eyes to what people are telling us their primary symptoms and struggles are. One class of struggles might be described as a kind of fixation, a stuckness, a blockage in moving forward with adaptive grief. And because people are so stuck on, fixated on the event story of the dying itself, and this takes the form of preoccupation with the death, a kind of level of traumatic distress as some of the most prominent symptoms, intrusive images of what they went through, maybe the collapse of their homes, maybe they were absent, but they imagined their loved ones, falling and being crushed beneath those collapsing structures. And of course, these kinds of intrusive images, so common in trauma of all sorts, may alternate with avoidance, kind of a parental experiential avoidance of the circumstances of the death, while in the background, people continue to ruminate, going over and over and over again, these silent stories of horrific loss, told in images as well as words. When this is the primary clinical presentation, it calls for specific procedures. Now, it is a large set of procedures, but all of them in some sense have the goal of what we might call restorative retelling. That is, we try to help people find a way of holding the story of the loss within a larger frame, and to do so in an emotionally regulated way that stays within their window of emotional tolerance, moment by moment, as we provide guidance, as they attempt to find words for what they have been through. To tell the story, they may look to tell the sequential story of those first horrific images, or the rumbles that they felt beneath them, or the telephone call that they received at distance, saying that their community had been destroyed. Waiting for the jet to go over. And in this, I'll say more about restorative retelling methodology. I'll even demonstrate a little bit of that. But this basic kind of prolonged exposure treatment that is done in narrative form can be supplemented, augmented, or replaced by a variety of trauma-informed interventions of a kind that might be very familiar to you, such as EMDR, trauma-adapted EMDR, drawing out the loss, literally portraying the loss on paper, the image of the scene of the dying as they witnessed or imagined it, in a way that then externalizes it and makes it something that no longer has to live within them. There can be various forms of directed journaling to help enhance people's meaning making about the loss experience. There are uses of creative writing, of therapeutic enactment, making use of music therapy procedures, mindfulness techniques to help people achieve that position of security or safety, or calm, even in the midst of horror. Now, I'm going to use this as one of the three points of focus as we move forward to suggest some of these interventions. But I want to emphasize to you that this is only one of the places that people can get stuck. And I think you will encounter these other two spaces as well. So I'm going to try once more to move your images, which are blocking part of my screen. Let me see if I can manage to do that. And that is, people can also become fixated or blocked, stuck in a way in moving forward with their grief because of a fixation on the backstory of their relationship with the deceased. Now, when people are struggling with this dimension of their grief, it's a very different set of symptoms and struggles that tend to present. They may experience unremitting yearning, missing, a deep sense of incompleteness without their loved one. They may experience a high degree of separation distress in relation to the deceased. They may likewise encounter a sense of profound guilt for not having been able to intervene or save them. They may engage in counterfactual thinking about almost reversing the sequence of events and changing something that would result in their loved ones still living. They may experience what we call unfinished business, referring, of course, to all of the unresolved emotional issues that may attend the circumstances under which their loved one died, and their role or lack of role in that, or the conflicts and difficulties they experienced in the course of living that now seem as if they can never be resolved in that person's dying. And all of this calls for a very different set of methods that we refer to as restorative realignment of the relationship with the deceased. There are a variety of techniques that can help us do this. One is that when I'm working with bereaved people, I will often practice a person-first form of therapy rather than a problem-first form of therapy. So I might invite people to take out their phone and show me some pictures of their loved ones that they'd be willing to talk with me a bit about, especially pictures of them with their loved ones. I would appreciatively inquire about what was special about that person. I may share observations about the image itself. It looks like the two of you are engaged in, you're having dinner there together? Yes, that was his birthday. What do you remember about that specific occasion and all of the birthdays that you might have celebrated together? And so we might have a 10 or 15-minute conversation that reveals the person and the relationship, not simply the symptoms and the struggles. So typically, as we begin to understand who the person has lost, we also come to understand much more what that means to them. It's not just simply a generic problem of anguishing grief that they experience, but it is a set of specific needs that grief therapy can begin to address. And we can do so through the practice of imaginal dialogues, chair work, what we refer to as internalized other interviews, in which we might invite them to play the part of their loved one and to respond to our questions about the client. Correspondence with the deceased, where we have numerous kinds of prompts we offer people to speak truly and deeply to the heart of their relationship and to the anguishing unfinished business in the relationship that they often bring to us. We can help them devise legacy projects and rituals that somehow go beyond what cultures often provide in order to honor those loved ones and to, in some way, give them a place in our ongoing lives. So I want to suggest then that both of these phenomena are signaled by specific clusters of symptoms, and they imply the choice of compatible procedures tailored to those struggles. But wait, there's more. Because sometimes in the immediate aftermath of loss, and sometimes nearly always in the longer term aftermath of loss, people are dealing with a third kind of fixation or stuckness or blockage. And that is in revising the personal story of who they are in light of this loss. If I'm a mother who has lost her children in this terrible earthquake, am I still a mother? If I am, how can I mother these now dead children? What does this portend for my sense of identity if I've lost a partner of many years? Who am I now without him or her? Every loss changes family roles. When my father died, this is a true disclosure, when I was 11 years old by suicide, I suddenly was promoted to becoming the little man of the family, a role for which I was very unprepared, as you can imagine, to somehow step in and take care of my younger brother and sister, and still harder, my deeply depressed and acutely suicidal mother. We may experience stigmatized identities. We may be blamed. We may be shunned, depending on the nature of the death. In many ways, then, we are often forced to ask the question, who am I now in the aftermath of this loss? And this calls for a kind of therapy that goes beyond the symptomatic struggles with grief to look at what we call restorative revision of that story of self. There are somatically focused, emotionally focused techniques that we use in order to come to understand aspects of ourselves that we feel implicitly in our bodies. If we place our attention in them in a period of kind of mindful meditative attention guided by the therapist, we can often feel that constriction that seems to hold us back, or that heart-rending pain associated with the grief, or the deep sense of emptiness that presents almost like a black sphere or hole or abyss in our abdomens. In 100 unique ways, we can begin to come into contact with how we hold our grief, how we hold our connection to the deceased, and we can work with that using language, metaphor, imagery in ways that are powerfully transformative. There are many other techniques, creative writing techniques, for helping us fit into the context of our life story, the story of our traumatic losses, to seek their themes, to seek the ways in which we have resolved similar crises in the past, and to engage in a kind of identity project in which we begin to envision and enact a new path forward toward a life that again has meaning. Of course, much of our meaning making about who we are applies not merely at an individual level, but at the level of our intimate relationships, most particularly in families. And so couples and family therapy have a crucial role in this work. And here, I think the point that I want to make most basically is that how we grieve is a function of who we are, who we have lost, and how we have lost them. And any one of those factors can become the focus of our work in grief therapy. It is frequently the case that people may experience a sense of brokenness and stuckness or obstacles in relation to two or more of these tracks. But at any one time, one particular set of symptoms and struggles will be predominant. That's the one that requires attention now. The others may well come in their turn. Do you have any questions for me before and I'll go ahead and break here. Any questions for me before we move forward and share with?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me, Dr. Robert?
I can, and
okay. I'm Dr. Esra. I'm an anesthesiologist and intensive care. That's why I want to get into this part, because this is very important for me to tell and to retell and to prepare the patients, not patients, but the family of the patients. Because as all of you may get the point, we have the patients in intensive care units. And when we declare to prepare them about somebody's loss or some conditions is going worse, that is the patient families knows that is also declaration for that. This I'm 20 years in this proficiency, but I have still challenges about it, because especially here in our country, you may have been attacked. There may be some other problems, the denying of the loss, denying of the that. At that point, we may also at the same time tell them the story of the disease. Then in another second, we have to tell them that the life is going on, then they have to plan about the funeral. That's the point I want to mention, and I want still help about it.
So if I'm understanding, in the kind of context you're working in, you have many goals, and sometimes they feel like they're competing goals. Your time is limited, and you have to talk about a bunch of things, including the funeral, which is very accurate.
Yes.
And what I'm going to say to you may be even more challenging, because I'm going to try to present some ideas about what's called restorative retelling,
Yes,
help.
that's why I wanted to ask it.
Right. But what I want to say to you in advance is that no one of us can do everything.
Yes.
We
We
need
have
a
to
team
at that time.
to address these multidimensional problems. We need collaboration between medicine, nursing, social work, psychology, spiritual care in some contexts. And we have to recognize the limits of what each of us individually can give, while also developing a network of professional relations that can ensure that we can point people toward other resources. I would also say that in my own experience in a medical context, 5 minutes of really attuned listening by the physician may be worth 5 sessions of psychotherapy for the loss 2 years later. So I would invite you to consider that even if what you give is limited in time, the quality of the connection that you offer will leave an impact of a very, very constructive kind for people that will start things moving in a direction that they need to go. They'll feel heard and validated in their pain and suffering. You may not be able to walk with them the entire path toward healing, but you can take a few steps with them as a good fellow traveler. So I don't want to simplify the complexity of the hard context in which you work. I want to respect it. And also to understand that it's with our great wish to help people bear their suffering with less anguish. We will often feel insufficient in what we offer. But what we also know is that it's often enough, particularly if we're joined by others who can assist with other parts of the journey.
Thank you.
I guess Ece was also raising her hand before. Ece, do we have time, Bob, for one more question?
Yeah, okay. The time is yours to use as you best prefer.
Hi, everyone. And by the beginning of the presentation, you had this term, sense-making predicts better grief adaptation. I didn't get the term properly, so I need more explanation about it.
In English, we say that something makes sense when we're able to wrap our heads and hearts around it in some way, when we're able to find orientation through it. Making sense of something doesn't mean giving an excuse for it, right? Attributing blame for it, although that may sometimes be the way we attempt to solve the problem, that the authorities failed, the buildings weren't built the right way. Why didn't the seismologist tell us that this was coming? But usually people are then needing something more than just that reactive initial attempt to fit it in, to somehow give it meaning or significance. We begin asking questions about, what does this loss now mean in terms of my core beliefs? Beliefs in a world that is at least somewhat predictable, a world that is characterized by justice, or a universe or a God that is benign and loving, or my ability to trust other people, or to believe that I can exercise some measure of control and safeguarding my loved ones from disaster. The disruption of these core world assumptions goes deeper. And it is often those shattered assumptions, as Ronnie Janoth Woolman once called them, that we're attempting to join people in reviewing and revising in light of the loss. So that's one level of the work that we go to, especially in traumatic bereavement. Now, I'll try to, as I talk about restorative retelling and show a couple of clinical videos about that, I'd like to try to give you a little more process detail. about some of the ways we might go about doing this, because I know that an abstract explanation is very insufficient. And indeed, our time today will be very insufficient. This is the kind of thing that really some days of training around will help make more clear. So,
Yes. Like, okay. Now it's more clear. Thank you.
yeah. So basically, I'm listening for the problems that people have themselves with it, and it might be very specific. It might be very general. Maybe as we look at some of the clinical videos, we can see some points that correspond to those ideas, so that it will be more humanly clear to us. You know, the question at some level is often, what does this mean now for my life going forward? How do I fit this kind of trauma into my understanding of who I am and what life is about? If the world really is so random, so uncontrollable, so dangerous, how does one live in such a world without giving up hope? You know, these are the kinds of questions that turn on ultimate meaning in the context of this work. But there are many levels at which we work with this that touch on the very specific and practical meaning making too. Are there other questions at this moment, or shall we move forward into some of that and try to give a better illustration of some of these processes?
Thank you.
For that. So let me begin then by addressing a few more remarks to this idea of the event story of the death. When people are really captivated by that kind of traumatic symptomatology and the focus on the dying as they endlessly replay it or ruminate about it, what might we do? And as we speak about traumatic bereavement, as I know we're focusing on the earthquake-related losses, I want to also broaden the focus here a little bit to understand a nested model of traumatic bereavement that includes, at one level, the responses that we experience in connection with all deaths, even in the context of illness and anticipated dying, maybe from a degenerative disease condition. Even under these circumstances of greater predictability, we may experience a profound sense of sorrow and yearning as core themes to deal with in the context of the bereavement support, or grief therapy. But in the context of all deaths, there is a subset of deaths that are sudden, that occur without a moment's notice. And these may arise, of course, from causes that are violent, but they may also arise in the context of losses that are not violent per se. A person experiences a stroke or cerebrovascular accident and dies suddenly, or a heart attack takes a person's life. In such cases, we experience shock and unreality. We have a hard time somehow even understanding what happened, the causes of the dying, what it all means. Just to make it real for ourselves can be a great challenge. Within the subset then of sudden deaths, we also have violent death losses. And again, these may represent the kind of horrific accidents and acts of nature that may be the focus of much of your work. They may arise in the context of homicide and suicide. And all of these violent deaths introduce yet additional themes of trauma, themes of vulnerability, of essentially a lack of trust in the safety that we had assumed in life. And then within the context of violent death losses, we can consider suicide deaths to have additional themes still that tend to be introduced, including a profound sense of guilt or a feeling of abandonment by the deceased, the person who ended his or her or their own life. So what I want to suggest is that as we move to these inner circles of violent loss, suicide loss specifically, which may almost certainly grow in incidents in the context of disasters like the one that you've had, people may experience all of these ripple effect at every one of these levels. They are dealing not only with what is distinctively a feature of traumatic bereavement, but they're also dealing with the same sorrow and yearning that all of us have when we lose someone very near and dear to us. And the shock and unreality common to all forms of sudden death. So I want us to think multidimensionally and to, in some way, view their experience through a wide angle lens that includes all of these. To say more then about the context of violent death loss specifically, I want to just point toward a few ideas and some techniques that arise within the work on restorative retelling, and introduce you to the originator of this in just a little while. In the work done by this originator, whose name is Ted Reinerson, and his colleagues, what they find is that people contending with violent death losses often are engaging in reenactment imagery. That is, they're replaying the events again and again and again as a kind of compulsive or obsessive thought process, as a visual flashbacks. They experience nightmares that feature these themes. They may also be preoccupied with rescue, the idea of somehow being able to rescue the one who has died, to turn back the clock, the calendar pages, to somehow do it differently. The whole area of if only thinking, or kind of counterfactual thinking, as it's called in the psychological literature, can be very prominent in these cases. A sense of revenge may also be yet another of these R processes. So reenact, revenge. And in revenge, of course, we may cultivate this idea of vengeance against authorities, against those who have failed to protect our loved one. Or, of course, in the case of homicide, revenge against the perpetrator of the murder. We experience kind of recurrent fantasies of reunion, of somehow coming back to our loved ones, recapturing that sense of connection, maybe in an afterlife, maybe in a nocturnal dream, often in a daytime fantasy. And we may experience profound remorse that we somehow could have prevented this event from happening. And this sense of regret, of course, contributes powerfully to unfinished business. The death imagery scale that Ted Reinerson, Joa Williams, and Elisa Reingold have tested out documents some of the patterns that are reported with frequency by those who have experienced a violent death loss. It's a simple 5-item screener following such loss, in which these different dimensions are rated for the scale of frequency with which people encounter them, with reunion and remorse being particularly prominent among treatment-seeking survivors of violent death loss, but reenactment being the single most common dimension. This kind of ruminative preoccupation with replaying in one's mind or in one's report to others the circumstances of the dying. In our own research, in many contexts, including most prominently and recently, a large number of studies that we did in COVID bereavement, in which people died often under terrible circumstances that conferred important risk factors for their dying. What we found was this. We identified 10 evidence-based risk factors not being there for the loved one at the point of death. The loved one dying alone without human presence, often of any kind, context of COVID, and often in the context of these kinds of disasters that are a focus for all of you. The inability to have a proper funeral, perhaps the body was utterly crushed, maybe never found. And the funeral, if possible at all, might have been belated, partial, and conferred very little by way of a sense of resolution or having done justice to the person's memory. People may grieve alone. They may experience anger at authorities, anger at physicians in the context of COVID. They may experience intrusive imagery of the circumstances of death and several other factors. And what we found in this research and numerous other studies is that disruptions in people's ability to make meaning of the event, to comprehend what has happened, to somehow fit it into their view of the world, and to find a place for themselves moving forward in that same world. This factor of disruptive meaning making was decreased as a function of the number of these risk factors people experienced. And this in itself predicted people's functional impairment in family, work, and social roles, as well as their anguishing degrees of dysfunctional grief, suggesting then that the function of grief therapy is to attend to all of the implicit unfinished business, traumatic imagery and symptomatology, and struggle for meaning that these kinds of deaths may entail. And so how do we do this? Well, one approach is restorative retelling. I'd like to tell you a little more about this now in the limits of the time that we have available. Restorative retelling was really initially introduced by my friend and colleague, Ted Rynearson, a psychiatrist who now is in his 80s. And Ted experienced the need to find a more effective treatment for traumatic grief following the death of his wife, Julie, who was pregnant with their second child, gave birth to that child, and then succumbed to a very difficult and entrenched postpartum depression. In the aftermath of this, the best that psychiatry and psychology of that day, the 1970s, could offer was not enough to save her life. And she ultimately jumped from the back of a ferry into the ocean, drowning then with her own pain, and leaving the baby in the house and the automobile full of Christmas gifts for the family, along with her suicide note at the ferry terminal. Ted's formulation then of this method I'll describe to you comes from his recognition of what he needed as a traumatically bereaved person. Jack Jordan, I also show in this image. Jack is another good colleague of ours who is specifically a specialist in the area of suicide bereavement. And he and I and a number of others use these basic restorative retelling methods, each of us with our own adaptations as part of a community of practice into which we now invite all of you. Here I want to introduce to you a client of mine who will be speaking softly. I might step out and turn up the volume slightly. And I want to introduce you to Guy. He is a Belgian client who I saw following the death of his daughter, a death to drowning in a distant nation where she had gone and was visiting with other young people when she was bathing in the sea off the coast of Morocco and was caught by a powerful undercurrent that dragged her to her death and nearly took the lives of other young people on the same site. Here, let me go ahead and share screen once more. And I want to play you just a little bit toward the beginning of our session, where we try to seek safe ways to re-enter this horrific story that he finds himself terribly traumatized by, and as he tries to, in some way, make sense of a senseless loss. Let's listen.
It is a different path. So
Turn up the
here's my
ball.
question for you. And I don't have a secret answer that I'm looking for. It's really a very open and honest question. What would be the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of reopening, even a little bit, the story of that loss, those experiences, those images, those feelings, as opposed to leaving it closed? Are there advantages and disadvantages to telling the story that I guess you must have considered, and kind of asking for time to do a little bit of that?
I feel there is an absolute necessity for me to somehow find ways to tell the story, because somehow it is a necessity for me to, as a part of integrating what happened to Sylvie into my life.
To make it real and a part of your life and not just left out of your life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm working, I feel at least I'm consciously trying to find ways, as we are sitting here
Yes, yes.
as a part, but at own pace, and I admit trying to find safe ways,
Yeah.
making experiments as well on what feels okay and
Yeah.
what doesn't.
I get it. And this is one such experiment that we're doing right
Which is
now. Right?
exactly.
And so here, let's imagine that Guy is speaking on behalf of many of those who have known the traumatic death of loved ones, who are trying to find some ways of voicing this silent and anguishing story of loss in the safe presence of another who can non-anxiously hear that same story. So they don't have to edit it. They don't have to buffer it. They don't have to leave out the hard parts in order to protect the listener. They can find a way of somehow including even the most difficult parts, as we also assist them with their emotional regulation in the course of doing so. And as they do so, they're attempting to weave together a story that makes sense of not only the events, but of themselves in light of those events. And so they are moving from a focus on the external story of the loss to a more internal one. This idea of braiding together different narrative processes in retelling is something that I came upon and developed really in response to some psychotherapy process research by my colleague, Heidi Levitt, and her colleague, Angus, who noted in their own research on clients' storytelling processes in therapy that often people would focus on the external narrative of the more or less objective story that you might capture on maybe a video recording of what happened and when. And that's one piece of it. It's an important piece, particularly in the era of traumatic loss, where much of that story seems almost unspeakably horrible. And yet, as Guy says, he needs to find words for that. It feels like an absolute necessity to integrate this into his life. At other times, we listen for and we invite more engagement with the internal narrative the emotion-focused story, the somatic story of what is happening in the client as these events are happening before them, as they're witnessing or reimagining the scene of the dying. And then finally, we're listening with one ear for the reflexive narrative, the meaning-oriented story that the persons may also be contending with as they begin to raise difficult questions about what it all means. I will mention, for example, as one quick example, one of the things that Guy and I did in that very session was revisit a horrifically painful scene in which Guy was called, and is known back in Belgium, to go to the morgue to identify his daughter's body after it had been repatriated or returned to Belgium from Morocco. But in the course of the shipment, the body was not cared for, as he said, and his daughter's body was so terribly deteriorated that he could not even recognize her face from the flesh that remained attached to her skull. The only way he could identify her was from a tattoo on her wrist that said Stephen, the name of her older brother, who she deeply loved, who had died in a vehicular accident 2 years before. That withered flesh on that dry bone was the one thing that let him know that this was indeed the body of his daughter. And in the aftermath of this, as he considered this one signal of recognizability and all of the multiple convergences between these two accidental, horrific, violent deaths. For example, the day that her body was repatriated to Belgium was the same day of the year which Stephen had died. They received the notification in the middle of the night at the same hour by the authorities of these two deaths 2 years apart. There were many of these convergences, and he struggled. He said, but what does it all mean? A friend of mine suggested, he said, that, well, Guy, maybe Stephen had something to do with your daughter's death. As if he were reaching up from the grave and pulling his favorite sister down into death with him. This is the kind of horrific need then to somehow make sense of this experience, but ideally not in these very dark terms that we engaged them across the course of the hour that we spent together in that session. Here, I want to share another example of this just briefly, and this comes from a review of death notification with a client of mine, a young woman named Erica. Erica's husband, Johnny, had been a special forces member of the Army called a Green Beret. Basically, it would be a kind of commando within the U.S. Army system. And on a distant deployment in another nation, he had written her a suicide note in which he described that he had had basically an affair with another woman, that there was no recovering from this breach in the relationship with Erica. He felt he had betrayed her and betrayed their 2-year-old child, Audrey. And he said, I'm taking the coward's way out. As she then scrambled on her phone to try to reach him unsuccessfully, try to reach his Army superiors and buddies to intervene in this situation. She was unsuccessful in getting through to him in any way. And it was only later then, as she returned to her parents' home to be comforted, returning from her work as a school teacher, that she received the notification of Johnny's death. Here, I just want to play a little bit of the straightforward restorative retelling of the death notification scene in connection with Johnny's death. Let's listen.
So it was kind of just a waiting game at the house, and it was about, I think it was like 7:39, 7:45 that
And here I must say that we're talking now 2 years following Johnny's death, and after she's undergone quite a lot of healing, but still has work to do.
got a knock on the door, and an army chaplain and an officer came to, it's just like what you see in the movie. And, so they came to the door, and I think my dad kind of took care of Audrey, and, my mom said, kind of guided everybody to her back bedroom, and that's where, they have to deliver the news. And it was almost mechanical coming out of the officer's mouth, just, that.
How was that for you? What was happening in you as these words were spoken, just as if out of a movie script? And
So here I'm inviting a shift from the external story to the internal one, just to fill out the picture, to braid these two pieces together.
you're cast in a role that you never auditioned for.
It was chaos. I just remember falling at my knees and like being by my mom's bed and trying to hold onto the bed. And, you did say, they assumed it was suicide by a gunshot wound. Then I think, my mom was crying too. And, I think
And
she
with those
left
words being spoken, right, it was suicide by a gunshot wound, and your eyes kind of go off to the side, almost as if you were visualizing that scene or what was going through you when those words were spoken.
just disbelief and confusion and why
Chaos. All of it just poured right in.
chaotic. It was overwhelming. It was unbelievable. I felt like this wasn't my reality. This wasn't happening. It just so my mom helped them, or I don't know. I went to my mother's. I went to her closet and just like curled up into a ball and just broke down. And then,
And so at that moment, you sought the aloneness of that closet to have that private opportunity just to fall and allow the breakdown to come and not to kind of have to keep it together.
Yeah, I didn't know what to do with Audrey. I didn't want, we didn't know how to talk to Audrey about it, and those very fresh moments of it happening. And, and so it does, from then on, it's almost like the first couple of weeks, it's just this numbness. And even, throughout, the rest of that first year, just that disbelief in reality. And, but that evening, I remember just starting to drink, drinking, some beer, and, we had good, the Special Forces community is pretty tight knit. It's a smaller part of the Army. And, so we did have people immediately that evening, finding out, and, they came to the house, and, I sat with one of my close girlfriends who's actually Audrey's godmother. And so, the support was overwhelming, beautiful after happening. So
Right from the beginning, I mean, from the breaking of the news through just each step of it, does feel like the support was there for you. You're held in the arms of family, in the arms of community.
yes, it was. I don't know how. I don't know how somebody could do this alone. You know? Yeah.
We might understand some of that conversation as about reaffirming meaning, even in the midst of this horrific loss. The meaning of family, the meaning of community, the meaning of this kind of intimate support at the darkest of moments.
Having somebody to fall into, really, it is just that the physicality of needing that like physical support. You know, I think you really
Just to literally be embraced, as well
yes,
as embraced in terms of care, but to
held together.
Held together. Now, that's just a tiny sample of one of a whole cluster of potentially relevant methods when one's dealing with traumatic loss. But of course, even in the context of such loss, that backstory of relationship may pose a whole different set of problems that require attention in its own right. In the context of bereavement work, we're not so much learning or attempting, as we have described in our 20th century grief theory, we're not just trying to let go, move on, withdraw emotional energy from the one who has died to invest it in other relationships. These 20th century kind of metaphors originating in the work of Freud and carried forward with a variety of other authors collides with our typical human tendency to look to continue the bond with the deceased rather than to discontinue it. And here in an image by Neimeyer entitled Les Amants, the lovers, we get a sense of maybe the non-physical presence of a loved one who is very much present psychologically, emotionally to a living person. The continuing bond implies that adaptive grieving commonly involves the act of reconstructing rather than relinquishing or letting go of our connections to those who have died. The goal is to project our loved ones in some sense into our changed future rather than simply trying to leave them behind in the past. We attempt to reclaim them as active participants in the story of our lives. We attempt to find ways and safe context to speak their names, to keep their stories alive, to access their voice, their values, to honor them in ways that are culturally accredited, as well as in deeply personal rituals of remembrance. And we also look for opportunities to resolve the unfinished business that did not die with them in a literal sense. So this too requires attention. And it's very clear that when the circumstances of death are very complicated, then so too are the self-blaming emotions that arise with this kind of unfinished business. I want to give you again just one snapshot from one of our many studies of COVID in the last 2 or 3 years, where we asked people to describe what sorts of emotional responses they had to the loss of their loved one to COVID. And possibilities included shame, guilt, regret, unfinished business, including unresolved conflict with them. And what we did is we found, as this kind of Venn diagram suggests, that, and I've never encountered this in any other study we've done, and we have done very many. In the study of over 200 adults bereaved by COVID-19, nearly 3/4 of whom had lost an immediate family member or an intimate partner to death. Literally 100% of the participants reported at least one of these 4 complicating self-blaming emotional reactions, with unfinished business being the most common. Over 60% of people describe themselves contending with this. And as you can see, most of them reported composites of multiple overlapping responses, with a third of them reporting all four of these experiences, suggesting a very complex set of issues that continue to follow them through bereavement in the months and even years that follow. And we have not done research on a Turkish sample to replicate this, but in the wake of the circumstances of the dying to these earthquakes, I would expect results that are not very different from this. That is, a complex blend of self-blaming emotions, including guilt, regret, unfinished business, very prominently. We find in this research and others that the age of the mourner is not associated with their level of anguishing grief. Even the time since loss, whether it's measured in weeks or many months, seems to be minimally correlated or related to the intensity of the grief. What matters more is the closeness of the relation. Of course, the death of an immediate family member tends to weigh more heavily in our grieving than does the more distant relations that we might also lose, though, of course, at times those can be quite profound. But the degree of unfulfilled wishes in relation to the deceased, the inability to be there, to perhaps express our love, admiration for them, the inability to experience more times together that would have been precious and that were anticipated. All of these can be strong predictors of the intensity of people's anguishing and persistent grief. And the level of unresolved conflict with them, the need to give or extend forgiveness, for example, is much stronger still. And these prove to be among the most powerful predictors of problematic grief outcomes. How can we address these? How can we address all of these complicated relational emotions when a person has died? And the answer is that we can promote dialogues with the deceased in various methods. We can use correspondence with the deceased. We can use chair work. We can use imaginal dialogues, even in our online virtual telehealth therapies, which I'll try to illustrate here in just a moment. Imaginal dialogues then representing the enactment of a dialogue or conversation between the client and the deceased, or maybe in variations of this, the client and a deity or wisdom figure in their spiritual tradition. It can be a dialogue within two parts of themselves, with the client performing both roles. These are almost always vividly emotional experiences. They need to be introduced not casually, but with a good deal of support. And this is just the focus of a whole 2-day training program, but we don't have time to get into that here. It tends to be very self-immersive, but also comforting in its longer-term outcomes, and indeed often in its immediate impact on people's grieving. It can be performed using the choreography of chair work in a kind of gestalt or emotion-focused therapy mode, having a person occupy an empty chair in which they imaginatively situate their loved one, and then with the instruction of the therapist, move back and forth from one position to the other in deepening the dialogue in the direction of what needs to be said. But it can also be done purely in the mind's eye, which is what we tend to do when we're working with people in an online therapy. And so it's that I would like to illustrate here with a client named Corey, an Indian American client who lost his father under highly complicating circumstances. As a young man, Corey was not complying with the kind of cultural mandate to follow his father's footsteps in the world of business. The father was a chemical engineer, a successful one, had formed his own company that helped supply the pharmaceutical industry. But Corey was always more artistic than he was scientific. And ultimately, what he did was founded a brewery. That is where he would make different kinds of craft beers, special beers. And he was experiencing success with this. And ultimately, to grow the business, he decided to take out a large monetary loan. And it's that loan then that caused the father, who never approved of this particular enterprise with his son, brought them into more heated conflict with one another, despite their long and loving relationship. And in the aftermath of that conflicted argument, the father suffered a massive heart attack when Corey was not present and died. And now Corey comes in a year later to contend with his grief about this. Prior to this point, we have had a meaningful kind of beginning of the therapy session, and we engage in some mindfulness practice, which helps him deal with the heavy anxiety that's kind of distracting him in the context of the session. And we essentially help him find a place of grounding in which he can then address the struggle that he has been having with his father. And it's in that moment now that we step into this imaginal dialogue. Let's listen.
Yeah. Because all of his principles seem to be saying, Corey, become like me. And there was that creative part of you, an artistic part of you that wanted to find expression, to really find his own path. And so this kind of almost a dialogue with Dad, sometimes a clashing dialogue, is something that still is occurring for you. It's just echoing in your own mind and thoughts and feelings now.
I wish I could sit with him now and say that I understand what you mean. I think I just was too strict and too rude to him. I just shutted him down because I thought, just like a regular everybody, he just wants me to be in his business. But at some point, I think he's being a father, trying to protect me from not doing something stupid.
Gotcha.
I think we could have. I just did not get time to reconcile with him. Is what's hurting me the most.
So here's my thought, Corey, and I don't know if you've had experiences in counseling or therapy before, but is that something you've had any experience with?
No, not.
Well,
Never needed to.
One thing that therapy can do is help us conjure a world that is different than the literal and concrete world that we live in, where we can invite dialogues even with those who have died, in order to accomplish maybe now some of what we couldn't then, to maybe almost seek a fresh start in the relationship by resuming a conversation that was broken off too early.
This idea of a fresh start is one that Corey himself sought in his opening statements about therapy. He needed a fresh start in a life that seems to have gone completely out of bounds. In his powerful grief for his father, he ended up being unable to work. He lost his business. He had no idea now what his relationship was to the family. He felt guilt essentially for having betrayed the father's principles and goals. And it's all of this that he needs to work on in the therapy.
By that person's dying. And I wondered even if that's something that you would be interested to do now, if I were able to give you some support in that. suggest some ideas for how we might go about it, just to reopen a conversation with Dad, being able to voice some of what you want very much in your heart to say to him. Would that be something that feels?
Yes.
Yes.
No doubt. I didn't know we could. Yes. Absolutely yes.
So let's sit with the yes, and just in the way that we began this session, open this conversation between us. Let's close our eyes together. Take a few deep breaths. And with each kind of lungful of clear air that we bring into our bodies, let's also bring some clear space into this room. A room that may feel crowded with anxiety and incomplete feelings about what didn't happen, as well as perhaps troubling feelings about what did happen between you. And in this, as you kind of quiet your mind, I would invite you to bring forward an image of your father, just as if he were to accept our invitation to join you today for a conversation, to take part in this session, and to have a kind of father-son conversation that was denied you, but needed by you both. If he were to come, and if we were to imagine a comfortable chair, could be a chair in your home, could be a chair in his home, that you would offer him to sit down with you, what would the chair look like? What chair would you offer him?
Chair on his patio.
A chair on his patio, yeah. And tell me about the chair. What does it look like? What's it made of?
It's made of wood with a reclining back. And he would sit there with a cup of tea in his hands, cross his legs in the evening.
So a kind of evening conversation with Dad on his patio. And you're seated there, right? Would you be seated kind of directly across from him? Would you be a little off to one side?
On the side.
Kind of a little on the side. And what would he be wearing if he were there, reclining in this chair on his patio?
I would.
So here we're strengthening the visual contact with the scene. We're making it real. We're having him essentially set the stage for the performance of this dialogue.
Shirt, probably blue color t-shirt with nice jeans.
Mm-hmm. So very kind of casual, comfortable kind of apparel. And if you were to meet his eyes in this moment, would he meet your gaze? What would his expression be?
He will pat me on my shoulder and ask me to join him and sit with him.
Yeah. Join me for a while, Corey. Sit with me. He would literally touch you, reach out to you. And in this moment, then, as you accept his invitation to join him, to be with him, what would you want to tell him about how it is for you now? in this time since his dying?
I'll say, sorry, Dad. You were right all along. And I'm here for you. And I'm with you. The family is first to me now, and all I did before and everything that I did till today was to make him proud, and just all I needed was a little bit of support from him. Validation that I was right, but
Yeah,
you were right all along.
yeah. Try saying this to him directly, Corey. All I needed was a bit of support from you, Dad.
So here the goal is to keep it real, to keep it dialogical, I-you language, not distant commentary about the relationship. So not what I needed from him was, it's what I needed from you is.
It was a better support from you, Dad.
Tell him more about what you needed.
I want you to visit me, to see me in the places I work. See how people loved my work. I wish you could see me having fun and enjoying what I do. Be there.
Try saying this to him directly. Dad, I wanted you to see me.
Dad, I wanted you to see me. I want you to be there with me. When people enjoyed what I did, I wanted you to witness those things to me, for me. I wanted you to be proud of what I do. But Dad, I love you.
Tell me more about what you love about him as a father.
I love that you're my dad. I love how you laid those principles and the guides for us in the life that you lived. Now I realize that how much you had to do. You always kept us first. You kept the family strong. And you tried your best, Dad, to raise me. You gave everything I needed. It was me who walked away, but you waited. And you never gave up on me.
Say to him, thank you for never giving up on me.
Thank you, Dad. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for forcing me to stay with you those evening nights. Now I sit outside, a cup of coffee, and I like to sit with you.
I still like to sit with you, Dad.
And I like to sit with you still, every evening.
As this moved forward, of course, I invited him to take his father's role and to respond to these tender and apologetic and reconnective words that his son had just spoken, and giving his father voice then. Corey affirmed his love and the specialness of this father-son connection, what he recognized was unique about Corey. And as we then turned back to giving Corey an opportunity to see what more needed to be said to Dad. What he poured forth was his sense of guilt, his need for forgiveness from his father, which he then was able to give in his father's words and voice. It was a beautiful moment, and as we concluded, I suppose it's about 10 minutes from now in the session, Corey was effusively wiping his eyes and saying, "It was so real. It was so real. I could feel his touch on my shoulder. I could hear his voice. I knew what he would say." And it was a beautiful moment of coming to terms with that. He spoke then subsequently about how we had gone to the place of the deepest hurt and allowed him to deal with that. When he could move forward to address the questions now about who he was in his life and what direction he wanted to go, while affirming family, but also affirming his own needs. So this is just a sample, a brief sample of some of the dialogue with the deceased that can help address some of that which was not resolved in the course of the dying. I want to close by giving some attention to this third dimension, slightly more briefly, but I also want to anchor it with a clinical video talking about people's need to reconstruct, to revise the personal story of the self, who we are now in light of our loss and the learning that it engendered for us. What we know from our research on a number of samples is that loss can be a catalyst for profound personal growth. Even in the midst of all of the pain, there also is possible gain. This typically unfolds across time, usually later in bereavement. And what we find is that if, as you imagine on this chart, post-traumatic growth, in the terms of my colleagues and friends Tedeschi and Calhoun, Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, they use this idea of post-traumatic growth, with which many of you might be familiar, to refer to the way in which we feel that we are stronger as a function of having survived our loss. We have a deeper appreciation for the suffering of others and also for what they give us. We may have a deeper or broader spirituality or personal philosophy of life. We may value life and its specific special moments more keenly. That is to say, there is a revolution for a substantial minority of bereaved people in the direction of profound personal growth and change. And we find that this is most likely when the deaths are traumatic. In the context of this particular study that I'm summarizing here, what we found is that higher levels of post-traumatic growth are indicated by higher points on the vertical axis of this chart. The farther you go out on the horizontal axis, the more prolonged grief symptoms people are reporting. And what we discovered is that at the midpoint in that scale, we find that the loss challenges people's assumptive worldviews, their sense of predictability, justice, control, all of those core beliefs we mentioned earlier. It creates discrepancies in what we believe the world should be and what it actually is. It creates distress associated with that. It compels people to reflect and process on the experience. And that in the mid-range of this scale, where our adaptive resources are challenged, but not overwhelmed, then it often can spur or stimulate adaptation and revision of our world of meaning. This is what we mean by post-traumatic growth. Whereas when the distress is overwhelming, then it's impossible to do this. There's no perception of possible outcomes. People are frozen and helpless in the wake of that extreme arousal. So part of our goal is in some way to help restore their window of tolerance for the difficult grief-related feelings in order to engage in the processing that growth requires. On the other hand, when people's grief symptoms are insignificant, are relatively trivial or modest, we're unlikely to attach great significance to the loss. It's unlikely to promote a profound change in our view of life. We're not going to revise our core meanings. The world is as it was, as it should be. Our grandmother dies after a long illness. This is the way of the world. It doesn't require us to look at things through fresh eyes. Now, this suggests then that our goal is to help people alleviate distress and to facilitate their adaptive coping, never pushing for growth, never prompting them to look on the bright side or to see the silver lining in the cloud, what they've experienced. We always follow people. We never lead or push them in the direction of growth. But we're sensitive to the potential for such growth that begins to percolate up in their reports of experience. Here, I'd like to illustrate this with just a few minutes of my conversation in a later session with Erica, who we had met before, following she was talking about the notification of the death and the experience of her husband's suicide in special forces. And here she begins to talk about rewriting her own identity in the wake of this loss, now 2 years out from that death experience. The first year, I should also summarize, she coped essentially by abusing substances and seeking out unsatisfying relationships with men. And so she used anti-anxiety drugs and alcohol to numb the pain of this horrific loss. And her life was becoming a terrible mess, just as you would expect. She got into a treatment program. She got sober, and now for this entire past year, has been living in a much more intentional and much more emotionally regulated way as she pursues the longer range questions of who she will be now in relation to her life, her career, and also her daughter, Audrey, who's now 4, having been 2 when her father died. Let's listen to a little bit of this conversation.
And now you say you kind of, shortly thereafter, right, within 48 hours, you were finding your footing again in the changed terrain of your life. And what is that feeling like to you as you kind of move into now this second year of living beyond his dying?
It's been different this year because, the first year and the first, weeks and months after into that first year, I think I was relying on substances, on alcohol, I had my Xanax prescription. I think, I was kind of relying on those to numb out the feelings and, make the nights go by and not feel as lonely. So this was a year of more feeling and I think maybe a little more clarity. But so finding that footing, I'm happy to be in that space and be in this space right now. And I do feel like, my life's going in a direction that I feel is meaningful and purposeful. And that's, I've found great love and joy in that, and in the idea of, talking to others about this and being open about it, and eventually, hopefully, helping professionally with these kind of things.
You may not be able to see the moisture rising to my eyes as you speak about this, but I'm quite touched by what you're saying. It's an extraordinary thing in the wake of such tragedy to be finding, as you say, a life that is meaningful, purposeful, and you can even find in your heart and in your report of your experience, room for words like love and joy. And that just suggests to me the prospect for such profound growth through grief.
Yes, I actually, I don't think I said this in the last meeting, but something I recently wrote down, and I thought this can be interpreted negatively, but it's not negative at all. But just a line of finding gratitude in death, and not that I'm grateful he died, but without this experience, I wouldn't be doing what I am now, what I've found, passion in. And so, there is there's some gratitude in death, and I think that
She has returned to graduate school in order to become a counselor, relinquishing her work in early childhood education, devoting herself to her daughter's life and to a different future in her own, while she also joins with the U.S. Army to formulate a whole new strategy for dealing with the epidemic of suicide in the ranks and the position that it leaves the families in. Remarkable work.
That's helping me move forward. Like that is, his death wasn't for nothing. We have to do something with this and with this experience. And
his death wasn't for nothing. We have to do something with the experience. This is what we mean by meaning making. When we spoke earlier in response to the excellent question about what we mean by meaning and sense making, this is part of what we mean by it. There are lots of tools and techniques that might help you guys in this work. I invite you to explore them if they're meaningful to you. I published a series of books with Routledge in which we accumulated a variety of best practices from therapists all over the world. And each of the 3 volumes, entitled Techniques of Grief Therapy, Creative Practices for Counseling the Bereaved, Techniques of Grief Therapy, Assessment and Intervention, and the newest one, New Techniques of Grief Therapy, Bereavement and Beyond, are all 100% different volumes. They're not just different editions of the same book. And together they include over 200 techniques and methods that can be incorporated meaningfully in grief therapy, including restorative retelling and some of the practices that we were demonstrating in the videos. Another recent resource is the Handbook of Grief Therapies that I just edited with Edith Steffen and Evgenia or Jane Millman. And it includes the discussion of many approaches to grief therapy, including meaning-focused grief therapy, which is my own home base. But there are many others that make useful contributions. And finally, the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition. I encourage you to go online and to look for portlandinstitute.org for organization. And you'll find a whole training program of recorded programs that you could take at any time of day, as well as monthly announcements of live online training that might be of interest to you. Finally, as I think Beverly had mentioned at the beginning, I will be doing some training coming up here in a few weeks in Turkey, and we look forward very much to offering that online training in greater detail for those of you who might like to join us. Let me go ahead and stop sharing and move back into a conversation with all of you. I'm happy to take 10 minutes or so for questions and answers. I appreciate these 2 hours that you have given me. What kinds of questions, comments, concerns, or criticisms might you have about any of these ideas or practices? And I imagine that you can feel free to raise those in Turkish. And Berna or another of the colleagues can help translate them for those of us who
Yeah, of course.
are not fully bilingual. Anything that you would like to comment on or ask about, recognizing that you're asking not only for yourself, but also for others who will view this recording and who may have the same kind of questions you do.
Ece,
Okay.
merhaba. Yeah, there's one question from Ece.
Yeah, it's not a question actually. I would like to say that it made sense for me. Thank you for your nice presentation. It was really helpful for me understanding the grief for my own. And it for me, it's like, I cannot, it gave me a different perspective, a widened one. I just want to say thank you. And that's it.
Well, I appreciate that generous comment. And I think you mentioned another thing too, implying that these ideas need to make sense to us in light of our own experience, because all of us stand on the same shaky ground as the clients we work with. Those of you who are joining today may well know someone who died in this catastrophe, and maybe more than one person, and maybe people who were very close to you. So especially for you, I appreciate your presence. But all of us as therapists stand on the same level ground as our clients. We all experience life losses that are life-changing. It's not a clinical problem that we can remain distant from. And so I do invite us to try these ideas and practices in connection with our own work, our own grief, to be more able to meet them with our clients.
And Jada.
Hello. I want to ask you about can grief have an end? Because in Instagram I wrote, I read some phrase like that. Well, grief can't have an end. It will last forever, but it would change the way it is, but it would last forever. Well, not forever, of course, until we die, but so it will have an end, or
well, I guess my own feeling about it is that the most important losses of our lives stay with us in some sense. The grief doesn't just, it's not just something we get over and we're done with it. We integrate it into our life. We find a place for it, but it is not every place. And so adaptive grief, I think, implies both a willingness to visit and revisit our grief across time. It will change as we change, as our social and, personal resources change. We can revisit old losses and make new sense of them of an adaptive kind. I think the other thing I would mention is that the grief that stays with us, if it is adaptive, it comes to weigh less heavily on us. And it makes space for a whole range of human emotion, just as Erica mentioned in that last video clip. She can experience now joy and love, gratitude. I can tell you she also could add the word hope to that list. Again, she's studying to be a counselor. There's interest and curiosity and compassion, all that are added to the list of relevant positive emotions, right alongside a deep, deep sense of sadness and regret for the tragic loss of her young husband. So I think that's what happens, is that the grief doesn't necessarily grow smaller. It's more that we grow larger. And we are better able to accommodate the feeling of sadness that remains but without the traumatic activation, without the sense of horror and helplessness with which we first held that grief, or it held us. So that would be my experience of it. And I think that's compatible with what we know in terms of both research and personal practice. Great question.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Begum.
Thank you for this wonderful gathering to all of you. I don't have a question, and I would like to make a comment. What Erika said, that her husband's death was not for nothing, you know, it has a meaning. Like all we experience in life, well, hopefully, at least for most of us, or for all of us who are here probably, are kind of directing, guiding us to a more purposeful, to a more meaningful life. This is how I feel at the moment. And throughout my personal story, like after the traumas I had, I have become, or I should say, I'm involved in trauma healing, and I've worked with many people who survived the earthquake. I now more kind of sense that, you know, the losses in my life really are meaningful, that they all directed me towards serving the humanity, serving to this beautiful world. So thank you for reminding this.
Yes, a world that is beautiful and it is broken at the same time. And it demands the best of us. It demands more than we can deliver, but it encourages us to move toward being more capable, more compassionate, self-compassionate, and compassionate with others, even others who differ from us politically, ideologically, religiously, to find ways of bridging into our common humanity and recognizing our collective vulnerability to repeated loss throughout life, as we invite it to become our teacher. In no way lessening the reality of the pain or sugarcoating it as a bitter pill. We need to taste the bitterness, and we need to taste the sweetness at the same time. In your wise words, I know that you know what that means. And I appreciate the inspiration of your saying so.
Thank you for your presentation. And I wonder, in your point of view, what's the place or the importance of spirituality and religion? As a therapist, it is always challenging for me because I wonder your ideas about this. Thank you.
Well, I think there are many ways of understanding spirituality, of course, and there are many traditions. Some of them join us, some of them separate us around the world. In the Abrahamic tradition that historically begins with Judaism, evolves through Christianity, and then reaches into Islam, seeing that as a line of development of spirituality that features a monotheistic universe, that is a single God who is sovereign and omnipotent, right, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing. This can be an enormous source of comfort at times when we can clearly hold the idea that such a God is caring ultimately in relation to us, and may have understandings that we cannot about these troubling and often traumatic or tragic events in our lives. We can hope for or pray for peace and strength and the sort of willingness to follow a divine plan that we can't fully understand. Other religions provide different kinds of resources. All of them provide ritual support for grief and so on. But all of those same traditions that can give us so much in the context of bereavement can also pose profound problems. Why does God permit my child to die of an overdose? My father to die by suicide? My mother to die in her midlife from breast cancer? How do I understand God's compassion, beneficence, goodness, when these things befall us? So we can feel betrayed in some sense by God or by the spiritual community that provides only simple answers to very complex questions. In another line of our research, we developed what we call the ICGS, the inventory of complicated spiritual grief, and the ICSG 2.0. And my colleague Laurie Burke, Burke, has been the major author on many of these shared papers, where we have identified within the monotheistic tradition, and especially Christianity, 3 dimensions of religious distress, religious grief, spiritual crisis or struggle. One of them is a sense of sort of alienation from the faith community. Maybe they expect us to move on and trust in God and submit to his authority. And when we don't do that sufficiently, we feel estranged from them. A sense of essentially a ruptured attachment with God, insecurity with God. No longer do we feel held, loved, understood, protected. Now it's quite the reverse. And we also may experience the insufficiency of religious practices or rituals. So it may be that, praying the direction of Mecca 3 times a day previously was very meaningful for us. Now it feels like an empty ritual, or we can't bring ourselves to do it alone. And so we essentially, any core belief that people have can be shaken by loss, including the spiritual. And so I'm always interested in questions like, do you have a spiritual view, a religious view? And if so, how has that served you or not served you in dealing with this difficulty? What answers does it help you find? And what questions does it raise? And often what we find then is that in some sense, the tradition gives with one hand and takes away with another. It is a resource, but it is also a source of great questions. We find in general with our research that religious people, deeply religious people, do not grieve any less intensely than people who are less religious or spiritual, but they grow more. They show more post-traumatic growth, possibly because those resources help them understand something of the role of suffering in human life, and yet still transcend that in the direction of overmeaning. So again, it's hard in 2 hours' time to do justice to even all of the research, much less the practices, but that's a partial answer to your question. And any other concluding questions, comments, concerns, or critiques? Well, how would I say thank you in Turkish?
Teşekkürler. Maybe the shortest one. Teşekkürler. It's a hard word to pronounce. I know. Kürler. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. Maybe just before closing, I would like to say something. As I've mentioned, 10 million people affected in the area, but also Turkey's 80 plus million country. So rest of the country also deeply affected by the earthquake as well. So it has been a collective grief.
Yeah.
It's really, okay, yes, grief is very individual in some sense, but also really collectively we are experiencing it. And also life is, pulling us apart. And sometimes we seems like we forget about the earthquake because we sometimes live on the other side of the country and it's on the east side of the country. And there are a lot of divisions and there are a lot of angers sometimes to people about that. I hear it, I see it. But I think the main thing to just keep us together, as you said, to remember our vulnerability. We are vulnerable. And then the compassion. I think compassion is a big part of the grief work, whether you work with it like professionally or unprofessionally, we are all like holding each other. So maybe last word from you about the compassion and the importance of the compassion in the grief work. When we work with our own grief as well, I guess it's the main part.
Compassion includes empathy. That is the willingness to take in something of the emotion and feeling and meaning of the other. But it also includes an active intention to help in some way. So compassion then implies action. It implies a stance of helping, of reaching out. In taking time to be with us here today, all of you are suggesting by your choices that you're interested to increase that capacity to reach out. You all are coming from a place of compassion and concern. We consider that to be very central in that kind of compassion-focused grief therapy that we attempt to practice. And in the PI, the Portland Institute recorded training programs, we have some training from Sherry Geller and also from Darcy Harris, two Canadian psychologists who specifically unpack this idea of compassion-focused care. Grief essentially requires that because, an eternity will not return our loved ones to us, at least as physical living beings. And so we are faced with a problem that can never be solved in literal terms. This is why we often approach it non-literally, metaphorically, analogically, experientially, somatically, emotionally, as, for example, in the dialogue between Corey and his father. You saw a little bit of. So I remain very hopeful that a compassionate outreach that also recruits specific, skillful actions on our part can make a contribution to people's self-healing and communal healing. In our country, while the level of devastation faced by Turkey can only be rivaled by the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or events of this cataclysmic impact, the impact of what we call 9/11 terrorist attacks on New York, Pentagon, and another airline in a state called Pennsylvania 24 years ago, had a similar kind of impact in some way in generating an absolutely national collective grief, which was both healing on one level, and it generated, some political decisions on the part of our government that probably greatly worsened human suffering, at least. So we have to be aware of what are the political consequences of grief. How can we ensure that those two move in compassionate directions? What can we learn of an affirmative kind for our community, and not just to engage in dialogues of conflict as a function of this. Anger can be an understandable secondary emotion that in some way protects us from the core helplessness of grief. And we need to make sure that the grief itself receives attention and not simply the secondary reactions to it. So that's a short response or a medium response.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's
Oh.
very, very helpful. And thank you for your sharing so generously again.
Well,
It was
I
really
look
beneficial to me, I'm sure, to everyone.
I'm
too.
learning much from you and how all of you meet this crisis. And you know, I hope that I will be a better therapist for learning some of the practices that you also devise to address this need. So, thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone being us here today. It was so nice to see all of you here together. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you for your time.